Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with bandleader Aldo Perez and singer Jenny Lee Mitchell of the seasoned New York City Sextet of jazz cats peppered with Vaudevillian-Style Comedy, the Jazz Bastards. This group first came together as friends who were also professionals in various creative fields. This band is excited to announce their 2026-month ongoing residency at New York City's renowned alt-cabaret supper club, Pangea. This group is a grand collection of performers that serve up indie bop with originals, standards, and slapstick, or as one puts it, in the midst of the neo-vaudeville, you realize that they can really play. So get to know this band and dig this interview, my friends.
So when Patrice sent me over the notice that there was a band called the Jazz Bastards, I didn't have to look any further. I knew that this was something that needed to be done.
Okay.
So first and foremost, I enjoy the name. Secondly, I listen to your music and what you do. I dig it. So thank you for taking a minute out. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. We appreciate what you said also.
Let's dive in here. And before we get to the new residency and some things happening ever present on your radar, let's talk about how the formation of this band came together.
Jenny and I, or shall I say Muffy Styler, because we use these other names, but Jenny and I were in a band for a while called the Ronaldo The Ensemble. And we sort of ran the course with that group through some clubs in Manhattan, specifically the Living Room. And when a venue like that, it was a tremendous venue, closes, it really changes the landscape and how a group like ours was able to comport itself and just have gigs. And because we were the residents there, we played like every other Saturday night at this club in New York, and it was a real scene. And after that closed, I personally went through a bit of an existential crisis about my music, because I felt that I had squeezed that lemon so much that I really wanted to and felt I needed to do something a little different. And I have always been had sort of one foot in jazz, but to really go into that arena was like a complete shift. So I found myself a teacher. I had studied with other like really great players like Tuck Andrus when I was younger, and other people who were terrific players, but I had never really gave myself over to the music. And then I got a teacher, Rick Stone, and I decided, well, I'm going to play, my version of what I think jazz should sound like. And so the genesis of the group happened where I wanted to do some gigs. Different members of my ensemble were clamoring, hey, what's going on with you, man? Because I'd been just shedding for, 2.5 years before I decided to say, okay, let's do a gig.
But basically, the reason we stopped the other band was like, we thought we really had made it because Tony Danza came to our gig once. And we were like, well, that's it. We've made it. Tony Danza. Oh, and the SNL members at that time, because Aldo used to hang out with Will Forte. And when we found people coming, we were like, oh, well, we made it. I guess we don't have to continue anymore. Tony Danza's come to our gig. Except that he was only at our gig because he was playing after us at the Living Room with his Jersey band. But don't tell him that. We said that.
And one little piece of the drier information was that we had a gag, because I didn't really want to, get a bass player. And I was like, well...
We never had a bass player. We had a tuba in our last band, and now we still don't have a bass player. That's weird. I just realized that.
Well, we had a bass player towards the last part of our last band.
Oh, yeah.
But certainly at this point, I was just like, why don't I just play the bass on the guitar? And I started collaborating with a drummer that I had been playing with for 30 years, because he'll do any gig I have. And we started doing little gigs in Brooklyn. And I said, okay, I'll play bass on the guitar while I comp the chords. And we started working with a terrific musician who is Wang Catalano in our group, Matt Canellis. And I gave him a keytar that I had in one of the closets. And thus the Jazz Bastards were born, because we were able to produce a trio sound, and we were like, screw it, man, this is going to be our, the core of our group, and it's essentially sustained itself for the last couple of years doing it that way.
So how did kind of the stage names and kind of the playful approach to everything, how did that start? What's the kind of the reasoning behind that, so to speak? I mean, I can on a cerebral level, I get it, but I guess just to kind of delve into it, how did that all come about?
I mean, I think, in the last band, as Aldo was talking about, we always had these very theatrical presences and dressed in costumes. So that's something that he's always done. And since I'm kind of in the vaudeville community, and our other singer, Glenn, was a Big Apple Circus clown. He was on a kind of a PBS reality show-ish kind of thing about the Big Apple Circus. And he is a character performer. Actually, his main gig is he makes all his money being Ozzy Osbourne, Santa Claus, Elton John, Dame Edna. But he's a really great singer, and he has been our buddy for years. And so he's a character, and we had this kind of idea that it would be sort of like as if the Rat Pack were kind of not musically third rate, but sort of never got their break, and they were kind of halfway in and out of some, maybe, let's say, shady business, like maybe they've got a bookie and they're gamblers. So it was like kind of in a way Guys and Dolls characters, but not at all neat and clean and cute, but really kind of a little bit gritty. And we had seen a lot of movies that like inspired us too from that time, like The Man with a Golden Arm and stuff about Chet Baker. And I had read 10 million books on Anita O'Day, who was like one of my heroes, besides Ella Fitzgerald and others. And we just came up with these names. And then Matt Kanellis, who Aldo was talking about, who created this character with a guitar, had never really done theatrical things. And his big thing was, I want to play jazz and play a crazy character with you guys, because he knew all the work that Aldo did with this really kind of ridiculous, over-the-top comedy combined with music. And these characters just kind of like came to life. And one day, I don't even know how this happened, but the drummer shows up to a gig with full-on neck brace, arm brace, patches all over like he had just been beat up. And I still to this day really don't know how Nick came up with that, but it was the most hilarious thing. And every show starts off with him tripping and falling. And there are still people who think like, oh, is he okay, when they see the videos of him playing. So it started off with these characters, and then I created this character, Muffy Styler, just out of working on jazz songs and realizing, oh, I could do this. This is funny if I was singing, but then this happened, or I did this with an audience member. And I also work at a club in New York called the Slipper Room. I don't know if you know it. It's a burlesque and variety show house where there's been a real big flourish of vaudeville and burlesque, old school kind of like variety show scene happening. And this club has an audience, 7 days a week. There are shows there. And I host the shows, the burlesque shows, as this character, Muffy Styler, who's a drunk jazz singer. So as the Jazz Bastards were forming, I was working on Muffy, and it really is really a lot of fun to do. And so it was pretty obvious that Muffy would be part of the Jazz Bastards. And so that it just kind of everybody, created their characters.
I could also add to this, like, because your question was specifically why comedy or how comedy.
Yeah.
Or how, that element. And it's really tragedy when that's what's funny. And when you see people who are down and out, can't get a break, smoking cigarette after cigarette. By the way, there's only one of us in the group that actually smokes. The rest of us are fake smokers. We're frauds. And we wanted to make fun of jazz musicians, too, because jazz musicians, I'd been working with a lot of playing in workshops and things like that, and people get very uptight and crazy. Like there was this one drummer who was like, do you like what I'm doing? I'm trying to, I thought you might like what I'm doing. It's insane. And so we're like, screw it, man. We're going to become the jazz band that's so neurotic and also like being chased by the mob on its last gig. That's the setup. is like we have one gig left before the hitmen meet us outside. And so, and we're putting our heart and soul into it. So the whole idea is that you're going to come and see a comedy show that's supposed to be about jazz, but it's really a jazz show that can't help but, mess itself up with comedy. So we don't plan it out. We didn't think about that so much as like, hey, we got to be funny or we got to do this. It's in our work. It's in our background. We've been comedians for years. We've also had tragedies in our lives. So it's the way that we would make any group that we do. I sort of think of us as the Harlem Globetrotters.
I just was thinking that. I just saw them in Kansas City here a couple weeks ago, and I was thinking about that whole timelessness of it, and that era, and how that era just never gets exhausted because, we all love actors and movies and entertainment. We have that suspension of disbelief, and it just feeds into it. But there's also that timelessness of jazz, of Anita O'Day and Sinatra and the Rat Pack and all those guys. There's going to be something that's going to resonate forever with listeners because it was so good.
You see Wes Montgomery in a suit, it's like there's just something that transports you. The people that you mentioned are like key figures in our tonal, headspace, as you can hear from our music. So there's also a responsibility for, to have a stage. It's like when you're up on a stage, you want to be able to like do something that isn't normally done or isn't, what you find in everyday experience. So maybe in the 1960s, those people wore those suits and everybody was like that. So there's many layers of irony that we're even unaware of.
Disney was always clowning around on stage, and some people really were mad at him for doing that because, he was, you're a serious musician. I mean, you've reached the top and you're the king of bebop and everything, but he couldn't help himself. And I think a lot of musicians that even nowadays when they're just in their jeans and their T-shirt and like, let's call the most complicated song and, but they still want to be funny. And strangely enough, we find a lot of people who come to our gigs who didn't know us, they come to us after and say, I want to do that. I want to be funnier at my gig. I want to do comedy. They don't realize that comedy is like the hardest thing to do, but it's nice, the sentiment that, and these are like really accomplished musicians coming and they probably don't know what the hell they're going to see and hear, but they appreciate it. And then also the fact that Aldo, or we have like a lot of contrafacts over a lot of things that are the comedies in the music as well, not just in the slapstick or the way we dress, but that the guitar player will play these incredible solos using the dumbest and weirdest sounds with the guitar. He's got them all programmed, and these rip-roaring, insane solos that Matt can do. He was with the Glenn Miller Orchestra for years before turning to indie music, before turning back to jazz, and it's hilarious. I mean, that's the biggest laugh of the whole night, I think, is when he plays the solo using these really cheesy Manhattan Transfer vocal sounds. And then we do scat and we do things together as a group singing that way. But he just does these incredible things that make people laugh just because of the musicality of it. And then we'll do turn on a dime stuff where we're playing a really fast version of Aldo's contrafacts to either rhythm changes or a bird tune, and then we're, turning on a dime and then something weird else is happening. And and people get that too, that the comedy's not just in the presentation but also in the music itself, like a drum solo that Aldo has to dictate using his mouth and then the guy gets upset, or there's tons of things, using percussion to salt and pepper a bowl of spaghetti that we eat on stage. And I know, a lot of stuff.
It kind of organically creates itself, and that's out of our personalities. We're also old theater people. We have done years of theater. Jenny and I have created 5 major pieces in New York City.
You just called us old.
Yeah, sorry.
Radio.
But it's what our background is. So there's we used to spend a lot of our time making fun of actors and being actors. So I'm not quite sure where that comes from in me. My father was a priest, and so I've become a clown.
You know, what's funny about Dizzy Gillespie is that, you know, these guys had this brilliance about them, and I think somewhere within them in that era of what they were creating, I mean, even Charlie Parker, you see him smiling all the time, and he's probably high half the time, but most of the time there was a gregariousness, there was this like playfulness that went into it, and I think that's the irony of what we have with jazz these days, is that people get they resist it because it's highbrow, they resist it because it's this higher level of art, and everybody takes themselves seriously. Now, I know after 930 interviews that that's not true. I realize this community is much kinder and more grounded, more gregarious than what the national media may show or the national jazz magazines. But at the end of the day, I think Disney was onto it kind of in the same vein of what you guys are doing. You can't take yourself too seriously, and if you do, your end product's going to snip it out, and they're just going to be like, all right, I can find something else, because there's always choices.
Yeah, very good point. And you remind me of something else, which is the idea of highbrow is a really it's a deception, because even classical music like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, just to name those guys, were all improvisers. Like all the stuff that they actually finished writing down was based on like being at parties. Well, not Bach, but he was an improviser. He would have contests with another organ guy who was trying to like cut him, and they would like basically just play free. So what Barry Harris talks about this, that jazz is really classical music. We've lost the sense because what we do is everybody just keeps reproducing it. And what happens in our work is that we just have so much fun. People are like, well, what are we going to do? And I'm like, let it happen. Let the music take us where it's supposed to take us. You know, a lot of jazz people know this, but they don't always know how to add that super fun part of it, where you are the rider, not the ride.
A lot of jazz musicians, and most of them are actually always really funny. I mean, if you're like in some kind of jam session or rehearsal, they're always cracking jokes. But it's just become so serious. I just finished reading this book called Intimate Nights, which gives the whole history of New York jazz and cabaret, which at certain times, especially the 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s, it was all converging. And, of course, Mabel Mercer and all those people who kind of started the late-night cabaret thing. And this guy, James Gavin, in this book, really shows that all the performers who, like, sang or did music they had comedy bits and they did music. Or if they were musicians, like Streisand, when she started off, she had her comedy stuff. Like they had pattern, and now everything's separated. There's like comedians who stand with a mic, and then there's jazz, which has of course become this other thing now, and also highbrow, and a beautiful thing. I mean, we just saw some Juilliard students playing and blew our freaking mind, but it's not together anymore. And in the old variety school, in this book, I read about some guy who played like Wagner on the piano with puppets, or a harpist who played, and then, or, you think of Blossom Dearie and all these people, and it's an other era, but there is a flourishing kind of art scene. I don't know in other cities, I'm sure, like in Portland and other places, but in New York City, of like that variety show feel. That includes, musicians and magicians or whatever. And we were talking to some guy we played in Italy who was an older guy who would play in the variety scene. He was like, yeah, and if like the magician didn't show up, I'd have to go out there with my clarinet and kind of play and move around and be funny to fill the spot. Remember when Les said that? And I thought, yeah, it is. We are paying homage to a time where that was sort of the norm in the cabaret and in the jazz scene.
It was a nightclub scene which would have come directly out of vaudeville. And vaudeville, you had 7 minutes to make people laugh their asses off. And if you didn't do it, you didn't get another gig. So there is a direct lineage to that work and what we're doing. But again, we don't overthink it.
Yeah, but it's like definitely different than anything else. I mean, one of our favorite singers I'll speak for myself, is Kurt Elling, and he was at Birdland, and he commanded the stage just like he didn't tell too many jokes or anything, but he was funny and he commanded the stage, and he had a suit. I mean, I know there were times in his career maybe he was just had a beard and a t-shirt, but his show was so good because it also had this great stage presence and,
had some class.
It had class. It was classy. And I think that's, like, coming back. But definitely there's nothing in New York like us. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, we're so, it just is something that I don't think people think of doing, especially there's some things that are kind of far out there where we, like, touch the limits of what it is. I mean, there are some cursing and nasty bad words, but also just, like, the folly of completely, like, the drummer gets to the point where he's like, well, I don't know what to do, and almost breaks down. And then he sings this really beautiful version of a song. He surprises the audience where the drummer just sings back there and plays a beautiful ballad like The Good Life or Nature Boy. But, basically it's a rip-roaring show. And also we added a member later after we had been playing for a year, which is my clarinet teacher. And he's really a kook, and he plays like 13 instruments, and he's a full-on jazz geek guy in his, I don't know how old Richard is. And I just said to Aldo one day, I said, well,
he's a kid.
We looked at each other. I was like, he's so weird. He has to be in this band. And we did want another horn player, and he's added so much, and he's definitely adds the comedy in his music too. He'll take like a whole solo over what song where he just plays one note, but I mean, he's just really
he does a Morse code solo.
A Morse code
over
solo.
4, which is well, it's on our recording, so that'll be on the record.
But he's actually trying to say something, like it's almost like he's
ridiculous.
He knows what he's saying with the Morse codes. We figured it all out, and he's like trying to get out of the band.
So let me ask you about your new residency at the Pangea in the East Village. You started on January 31st. Talk to me a little bit about this.
Jenny started doing gigs there a few years ago with her cabaret show, and I pitched, hey, let me do a show here, or could we do it? And it wasn't quite ripe because they were charging, they had a certain business model. But a year later, it was just, the time was right. It's like you plant an idea in someone's head, and then it's just the right time to do it. We made a deal with the club. Hey, bring us down. I've been a promoter and producer of shows for years. I know how to do that and to make an interesting night. And they saw my other work online, and so they trusted me enough to say, let me give this a shot. Understand that we're in development, and that when you're in development, it's like your audience building. I want to help the club. That's my other, feeling, because they're really awesome guys there, and you don't find that. That's not typical. Usually, when you're walking into corporate situations where things are all sewn up, forget it. But these are individuals who own the room, and it was like an old school moment. And so I made a deal with them to let me cornerstone the work that we're producing just there, and that's what led to this, residency. During this time, we've also produced a jazz festival. I play flamenco guitar and classical guitar, and I did 9 months of playing for them. And they've expanded, so there's the halo effects go in both directions. They have interesting work there. We've brought also many artists there. So we're woven together in a way that I really, really like. So it's not just a cold residency in some, room. It's like there's a family feeling to it. And New York used to be like that a lot more. And we're very, very honored to be able to be part of something that feels like that again.
That's a quite triumphant way to kind of wrap everything up. Thank you for talking about the history of the band, your new residency. Good luck with everything. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. You're awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Aldo and Jenny on behalf of the Jazz Bastards for their time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.